Good morning. About me, I'm a senior security analyst at BB&T. I focus on web application security. I've done a lot of different things throughout my career: web app development, operations, system administration, DevOps, and a bunch of stuff with digital video. But generally, I end up with other duties as assigned. This has led to me getting a wide variety of skills and helping a lot of people, especially in operations, understand what's going on at a deeper level. They may not have the programming experience to understand what's going on, so I'll try to give that to them in part, how they can actually understand the deeper solution rather than just temporary fixes. The obligatory disclaimer: I am not speaking on behalf of BB&T or any other entity. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation do not necessarily represent those of my employers, past or present. The origins of this talk: something that I've really enjoyed at some security conferences is the historical information that has absolutely nothing to do with our day-to-day life. A good example of this is the rethinking of the origins of the lock by Schuyler Town. The YouTube link up there is a link that he gave at CarolinaCon, I believe, 2 years ago. Or if you prefer to read about it rather than watching, he's got his research up there. It basically covered the history of the lock from ancient Egypt until 1850, which, unless we have time travel going on, is not a terribly practical set of skills, but I found it a very interesting talk. There's the book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. This came out when I was about 9 or 10, which is one of those really influential ages. And he wrote about cargo cults. He's probably the person who made it most famous outside of anthropology. And he concluded the book with that, so it made a big impression on me at the time. And then I've got my experience in development, operations, and security, and seeing how cargo cults are something that we have going on in the Feynman definition in those practices. I suspect most people know this quote: "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic," Arthur C. Clarke. There's definitely a bit of superiority complex in the anthropologists who did the work on this. We were going into micro-Asian nations that were established or colonized largely by the Europeans in the 1800s. So we had many centuries of high-tech development going on, and they were relatively undeveloped at the time. If you ask someone what a cargo cult is, if they don't give you a blank stare, they will probably give you something very close to this. This is the quote that Richard Feynman had in his commencement speech at California Institute of Technology. "In the South Seas, there is a cargo cult of people. During the war, they saw airplanes land with lots of good materials, and they want the same thing to happen now. So they've arranged to imitate things like runways, to put fires along the sides of the runways, to make a wooden hut for a man to sit in with 2 wooden pieces on his head like headphones, and a bar of bamboo sticking out like antennas. He's the controller, and they wait for the airplanes to land. They're doing everything right. The form is perfect. It looks exactly the way it looked before, but it doesn't work. No airplanes land. So I call these things cargo cult science, because they follow all the apparent precepts and forms of scientific investigation, but they're missing something essential because the planes don't land." This is a relatively good statement, but it's not actually that accurate about what was going on with actual cargo cults. This is a quote from just after World War II, describing an interview with some of the people in Polynesia. "Each time the machine tore down the clearing, rice, flour, axes, and goods of all descriptions came hurling to the ground. The local people sat in awe and wonderment, their eyes wide open to the sight. To them, the airplane was a messenger from the heavens bringing food to spirits who had become stranded." There's a number of characteristics of what's called cargo cults. They're Menelarian. Those are groups that are focused on religious prophecies that deal with gained sovereignty and wealth, often with apocalyptic overtones. These are not just found in the South Pacific. Some of the early Jewish groups, including early Christianity, might actually be defined as these. Ritual acts that will bring material wealth, kago, in the Pidgin dialect, and specifically often related to airplanes after World War II. They're commonly started or led by a charismatic religious figure. They have a fusion of traditional beliefs with Western culture, especially biblical prophecies. They feature the ancestors of the members as protagonists who will come back, often bringing the goods. And they were found in Melanesia starting from the late 1800s through today. Melanesia is that part right above Australia. It's most known for New Guinea and Fiji. We actually had, for those of you that are sci-fi buffs and are familiar with the term retcon, the term cargo cults actually came about in the 1940s. But then they have taken this term and extended it back through the Tuka movement in the the late 1800s. Retcon, if you're not familiar with it, is retroactive continuity, where there's a change in something like a sci-fi show, and they modify what supposedly happened before to fit this new understanding. It's fairly common in Star Trek, for example. A background on what Fiji was like in the 19th century. They had sandalwood, and that was nearly clear-cut to oblivion by the Europeans for trade for Japan. There was an influx of modern weapons, specifically guns. They had made traditional minor skirmishes into violent bloodbaths. There were certain people, both native and non-native, who would exploit this and go in with rifles and just pick off members of opposing groups from a distance. There is the traditional sickness that happens when the Europeans came into this area that had largely not been exposed to the diseases before, such as smallpox. There was the introduction to alcohol, which often leads to alcoholism and suppression of native independence. There was what one author charitably described as the depredations of labor recruiters, and also the influx of missionaries spreading Christianity and other Western thoughts into the society. The Tuka movement is fused together from two words, likely meaning literally upright forever, but having the intent as being immortal. It started with organized costumed militias. They used a mixture of native European and biblical terms. For example, the high officers were called destroying angels, whereas the low-level members were given traditional tribal names. They were led by a prophetic leader, Dudugumi, who claimed various occult powers, ranging from, at times, resurrection to the ability to see the past, present, and future. The movement had a number of promises. First, that the end times were near, that there'd be a return of the ancestors, that the practitioners and followers of them would receive eternal life and youth. There would be plentiful goods, especially Western ones, and the traditional death and subjugation to unbelievers, and the Europeans would be driven out. It was relatively quickly put down. Nugu Moi was arrested, then imprisoned, exiled, and dies in exile. However, the legends continued after his death and led to flare-ups of practices for about 2 decades afterwards. The British responded with typical colonial practices, such as razing his entire village to the ground, expelling all of the people who lived there, and refusing to let them return for about a decade. Into the early 20th century, the core concepts start spreading throughout the surrounding islands. The Tuka movement pops up here and there, and the core concepts of the goods, the ancestors, the expelling of the white people continues until World War II. World War II brought the big change of the Japanese coming in, and they were the first non-Europeans that they saw coming to the islands and bringing the cargo. At first, many of the islanders embraced this. They were able to get rid of many of the despotic colonial leaders that had been oppressing them. But the Japanese did not turn out to be that much more benevolent rulers, especially as the Pacific campaign got tighter and they ran out of food. They would often start driving the islanders out of their own villages and confiscating all the food. As the Americans started coming in, there was another big change where they noted that there were actually black people who had quite a bit of power. They had the technology, they had the cargoes, and these people became kind of heroes to many of the people within these groups. There's one of the best known groups is the John Frum cult. It's a fairly typical group. It started in the late 1930s, early 40s. There was a very charismatic local leader who had dyed hair and eccentric dress, who, similar to many of the other characters, claimed prophetic ability, and that he had various magical powers. I believe he also claimed levitation. The colonial powers eventually suppressed the movement, and as with the original Tuka movement, the leader was imprisoned, he was publicly humiliated, and then exiled. The arrival of the American troops with cargo during the war led to the revival of John Frum, except now, rather than just being John Frum, it was John from America. The local legends vary. He's sometimes a black soldier, he's sometimes a white soldier, but it's a practice that continues to this day. There's a John Frum Day where They dress in military garb that they've made that resembles the American uniforms of the World War II. They raise American flags. They use various iconography. After World War II, this picked up increasingly, and they began mimicking the iconography and practices of the American troops that they'd observed. This is what Feynman talks about, where they have the pseudo airstrips, they have pseudo airplanes. He slightly misunderstands it, in my opinion, in that they did not actually think that they were going to summon the cargo with these things. It was more as a celebratory ritual and expressing of a desire, rather than actually practicing it as a form of magic that they expected to work. They use the Red Cross iconography for the flags. They use the American flags. Some of the desired cargo that was expressed by this group to various anthropologists that interviewed them after the war, highly exciting things like calico and electric torches and refrigeration. Calico was one of the things also specifically cited by the Tuca movement. Jeeps and refrigerators and canned food, icebox, a pair of trousers, and a sewing machine. Fabulous shiploads of refrigerators, Jeeps, bulldozers, and of course, bottles of Coca-Cola. These statements are often filtered through the viewpoints of the Western interviewers. Some of the actual interviews, if you look at them, it's more of an expressed general longing for a better lifestyle, things like enough food for everything, for everybody. And in some cases, the interviewer appears to be putting these words in the mouths of the people being interviewed. But obviously, refrigeration is one of the things that commonly comes up. Nobody likes food poisoning. And it's something that they saw that made a tremendous impact on the health and safety of Americans, and that is something that's commonly cited as something that the cargo cultists wanted. What do the cargo cults mean? This is a series of movements from the late 1800s, so there's no single group. We can't say that, this is what caused it, this is what they wanted, this is what they thought, but there's a variety of different explanations. Again, a lot of what we have is filtered through extremely biased views. The colonial authorities were not exactly open to alternative cultures in the way that modern practices might be, and even the ones setting them right after World War II were filtered through the very American viewpoint. In some cases, they were genuinely religious movements. It's not that uncommon that a charismatic leader, be it David Koresh or a member of a Polynesian island, pops up, says he's got special abilities, and is charismatic enough to attract a number of followers. Some of it is just blatant mimicking of Western consumerism. When it comes down to a lot of it is sitting around wishing that you had stuff that you can't afford, that you don't know how to make it, but you see that your neighbors have it. That's a pretty good description of a lot of America at this point also. Some of it is a reaction to colonialism and especially the horrors of World War II. It was extremely devastating, the island campaigns that were waged against the Japanese by the United States. These islands were heavily bombed. They were nearly run out of food by the Japanese. In the post-World War I European society, we had Dadaism as a reaction to the horrors of war. They get mocked a lot less than these cargo cults do, even though they did things like combining different cultural elements, absurd dress, absurd outfits, doing staged recreations of things and ceremonies. It's also a form of nationalism. These groups were oppressed heavily with colonialism. Specifically, they were forbidden to unionize for the most part. They were forbidden to go on strike. They were forbidden freedom of assembly, and they were forbidden political power. Religious movements were one of the few ways that they could actually assemble and do these sorts of things. So here's another example of our society where we do absolutely absurd things and combine different cultures. I think we could do well to be a little bit more charitable to the cargo cultists. But also part of the fun of the Shriners is they know that they're not the real thing for the most part. They know that they're getting out and being goofy and having fun, and that's part of why it continues to this day. It's become a tourist attraction, so simply by continuing to do John Frum Day once a year, they know that there'll be an influx to the local economy. And most people like an excuse to get together and drink, sing songs, get together with their friends, tell the tales of the old days. That's part of what it still means to them. Back to Richard Feynman, he introduced the term cargo cult science. If you're not familiar with him, he helped develop the atomic bomb, he solved the Challenger explosion. He did a lot of really cool stuff in his life, and as I mentioned, he had the famous book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, that made an impression on a lot of young geeks in the late 80s. He introduced the concept of cargo cult science in his 1974 commencement at the CIT. To him, cargo cult science was a lot about deception. It was either about deceiving yourself. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself and that you're the easiest person to fool. When you're conducting scientific work, you really want it to succeed. Our scientific culture does not reward failure. Oftentimes, an experiment that has bad results can still be very, very useful to someone down the line, so they don't either recreate your work or they can take the little nuggets of what did actually work within your experiment, tweak it, and make it actually work out. But that's not something that culturally, or more importantly, financially, that we reward. So there's a strong incentive to work things out in your favor. There's the famous line that, statistics are mostly lies. And that's one form of what he viewed as cargo cult science. He also talked about how when you're going up against an established experiment, you may not think that you're good enough if your experiment proves that other one incorrect. If you're going up against a famous physicist who everyone takes as doctrine, and your result says they were totally wrong, you may take your perfectly valid results and throw them out and assume that you did the experiment wrong. So that's one of the form of understanding that he wanted to fight against with cargo cult science. Then there's also cargo cult science as deception of others. You may know that your experiment failed, but again, because you need to keep your research grant, you need to keep your funding, you want to get published, you may not give all the correct information, you may give limited information, or you may outright lie. The idea is to give all of the information to help others judge the value of your contribution, not just the information that leads to judgment in one particular direction or other. An example of this he cites is that a famous oil company claimed that their oil was special because it didn't soak through food. This is a lie by omission, because at that temperature, no oil will soak through food. And at different temperatures, all oils, including that oil, would soak through the food. He wanted to make sure that people did not just give limited information, that they provided a full description to everything possible, even leading people down to this is what might cause us to be erroneous, so that people could validate science and be more accurate. The explosion of the Challenger confused a lot of people. They had a number of very bad ideas about what might have caused it. And he saw misinformation and especially leaving out of pertinent information going out to the public. So it got to the point that he actually recreated what he felt caused the explosion live on stage during a press conference. The experiment worked, and that was when he got the ability to actually go through and demonstrate to the world what caused the Challenger explosion. I know that I've been rambling for a while, and this is a kind of dry presentation, so I'll throw in the obligatory XKCD. For those sitting on the side who can't see it, it features zombie Feynman. But it comes down to the core of ideas are tested by experiment. That is the core of science. Everything else is bookkeeping. This brings me to cargo cult programming. There's a famous quote that most people are probably familiar with. On 2 occasions, I've been asked, "Pray, Mr. Babbage, if you put into the machine wrong figures, will the right answers come out?" I'm not able rightly to apprehend the kind of confusion of ideas that could provoke such a question. Cargo cult programming doesn't quite answer that question, but it provides a different one. What if you could use the wrong code and still get mostly the right answers to come out? Language is a virus, and viruses mutate. As I said, Richard Feynman made cargo cult science all about truth and deception. Here we actually go back to the concept of ritual and lack of understanding of the original cargo cults. In 2003 or 2004, the term concept of cargo cult programming came about. The precise origin isn't clear, but it appears to come out of Microsoft's programming group that did a lot of professional writing at the time. Steve McConnell, who is the author of Code Complete and a couple other famous coding books, coins the term, and then Eric Lippert writes a series of blog posts about it. If you work in IT, have you encountered these types of programmers? They understand the form but not the content of programming, understand what code does but not how to actually write their own code. This is also common with cutting and pasting of code from Stack Overflow. You solve bugs by making more or less random changes until the code passes the test conditions. Consistently applies incorrect design patterns for the problem. These are all things that are commonly found in computer science, and part of it is the education system where we don't necessarily teach people to think through the problems. We say, here is an algorithm, it solves a problem. If you're a PHP programmer, you may not know how the sorting algorithm works at all. You just say that, I pass in this variable, this array of variables, and magic happens and it comes out sorted. That works some of the time, but it also leads to not understanding performance problems, not knowing when to apply better, more efficient forms of sorting. In a nutshell, it comes down to you perform a magic ritual, and it could be cutting and pasting from something, it could be taking someone else's code and tweaking it, and you imitate it. Part of what they talked about is how companies may not, it can happen at a company-wide scale. You can say, well, Google does such and such, or Cisco does such and such, a famous example being Cisco and Microsoft's stack ranking, where they go through and cut 10% of every single team every year until they finally eliminated that. And Microsoft and Cisco make a lot of money, so we should do what Microsoft and Cisco does. They take the magic ritual that they perceive as causing the success, and that may not actually be what caused the success or not. And they just go ahead and do it, and surprisingly, it doesn't work out so well for them. I've also seen this a lot in operations. Everyone's heard the famous, well, have you tried rebooting the computer? People don't take the time to understand the problem, work through it, and actually solve it. Hitting reset doesn't actually work necessarily. I worked at Virginia Tech and did room automation systems for distance learning, and I had a frustration because it took about 10 minutes to do a complete reboot of the systems. And people would not necessarily take the time to understand when we had the specific set of symptoms, if you did this 5 to 10 second fix, it would resolve the problem. So during the class, sometimes the people that didn't know how to resolve the issues would just hit reset on everything, consuming 12% of the entire classroom time. I tried to fight this by, making it easy, giving help menus, doing the hands-on training session, saying, here's a set of symptoms, it is caused by this is what you need to do in order to fix it. Which takes me to cargo cult security. I have not seen the term used a lot within security. I'll mention cargo cults and get the blank stare from a lot of people, so I thought it was worth mentioning here. There's the curse of automation. As an industry, we're doing more and more. We have fancier and fancier tools that take massive amounts of data, more data that we can possibly consume ourselves, but they kind of spit out these meaningless alerts, and a lot of the time we don't have people that are properly trained to understand what's causing them. That you get this specific thing that pops up and says that there's an issue, and you click OK, and you may go through a series of steps that the manual says to do or that the playbook says to do, but you may not be understanding the actual security implications. There may be a much more serious security incident going on, and you may skip over it because you don't take the time to understand what's actually happening. There's a lot of pen tests that are actually, you go into Nessus, you click scan. A lot of SOC work is done by the people that have got that barrage of tools firing at them. As mentioned in the talk yesterday on why your SOC is going to fail, we don't give proper training to these people. I don't want to come across as criticizing the people who are using these tools for the most part. We throw them into the deep end, and training budgets are not there. The time to give training is not necessarily there. And there's a lot of cutting and pasting, not necessarily in code as with cargo cult programming, but you take the output of your tool, be it Burp Suite, be it Nessus, you cut and paste it, you hand it to a set of employees who receive it. They don't necessarily understand it either, but we've done something. We've performed the magical ritual, therefore we are now secure. And I think that as an industry and a group that we can do a lot to fight that. So what can we do? If you're reading or watching this, you're probably not part of what I consider to be the problem, because we're here at Saturday morning listening to a talk on security. Some of the things that I try to do, I do mentorship both inside and outside of work. There's a lot of excitement out there. There's local DEF CON groups springing up left and right, as far as I can tell. There's security conferences, such as B-sides, that are free or nearly free for many people. There's people that hang out on Reddit, IRC. There's a lot that we can do to start explaining the processes and concepts that are underlying the issues rather than just what you do to fix it. I've had some success at work doing lunch and learns. There's a little bit of pushback in some of my cases from management who didn't necessarily think that taking the time out to do the training was worth it. But I got an hour here, an hour there, 2 hours, 4 hours. If you can show the success of coming up and giving people the training and figuring out the metrics that show that it works and showing that to your management, you may be able to start succeeding doing this within your organization. Focus on teaching what's going on, not just how. I've got other talks that I give, for example, on basic threat hunting and web application security logs, where I would frequently have requests from the security staff that get these things. Are we vulnerable to the 1=1 attack? Because you've got your IDS, your IPS, and it says 1=1 attack, alert, alert. We haven't taken the time to understand, go to them and say, this is SQL injection, this is how it works. 1=1 is a common flag that indicates that it might be going on, but that's not the important part, that it could be 2=2. There's any number of things that work within SQL injection, but we've taught them this one very narrow little scoped feature, and they don't understand what else might be SQL injection. And we can also reach outside the immediate security community. There's a lot of people that are our eyes and ears, especially if you're the blue team, and if you can start imparting how security works to them, that can help them provide more accurate information that, hey, something's a little wonky, something's off about my system. You might want to take a look at it. So I wasn't sure that I could fulfill the entire time slot for this just talking about cargo cults, but I've talked about the issues underlying this with a number of people, including some librarians. There's quite a few professional librarians within my social circles. And there's a concept called the reference interview that librarians use. And it's close enough to the concept that I thought it would be a good thing to tag onto the end of the cargo cults. And it comes down to one of the valuable lessons that my mentors have taught me early in my career, is it's really, really important to understand what the actual question that you're trying to answer is. It's very easy to say, I've got a problem, here, that's the problem I need to solve, what can I do quickly to solve it? But it may not solve the immediate problem. The database is down, it's an immediate problem. Obviously, you want to get it back up. But why is the database down? Is this something that's going to recur? Is it going to happen on someone else's shift? Is there a configuration issue? We don't necessarily take the time to understand it all the time. Those of you that are parents, and people come to you a lot, and they may be asking the wrong question. They may not be understanding the full scope of the problem. Those of you that are parents may have the scenario where you're in the lounger after it's been a long work week and your kid comes up to you. How would you get hornets out of a tree? And you can give 100% accurate answer to that. You can take a hose, you can blast them out, you can smoke them out. And you lie back down in the lounger, and 10 minutes later you start to wonder, why were they trying to get hornets out of the tree? You don't take the time to understand what's being asked of you. Sometimes you might end up with an expensive trip to the ER. And to the reference interview. There's a concept within librarians of the reference librarian. They're the hardcore people that help you solve questions. They may help you find the things that are deep in the stacks. They may answer questions that are not immediately answered. They're the people that do a lot of the training on how to use a computer, how to do searching, how to use search engines at this stage. And they have a process that, depending on who you ask, is between 5 and 7 stages. They use slightly different terms for the stages. Sometimes one stage is combined with another, but it's got 5 core concepts. The first thing is approachability. I chose this over another commonly used term, which is welcoming, because it's not just about being welcome to the person, but it's making sure that people know how to find you, making sure that people know how to find the person who can best answer the question within your organization. And I know it's fun to be the security curmudgeon or the IT curmudgeon, and the person comes up and asks you a dumb question, and you growl at them because they're interrupting your day, and you're just kind of nasty me and tell them to go away. It's fun, but it doesn't actually necessarily solve the problem. One of the big problems is we sometimes browbeat people to ask us the simple questions. And when you've got a lot of experience in the field, when you've been doing this for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or you're a geek and you're dealing with something that doesn't work with computers day in and day out, it's very often to assume that someone's dumb just because they're asking a very simple question or don't understand how to do something on a computer. But again, especially in the blue team field, we need people to not be afraid to come to us with questions. The second part is listening. You want the person to ask you the question, and one of the techniques they do specifically is you paraphrase the question back to them to make sure that you've understood what they're saying. You don't modify it, you don't go off on your own tangents, you just do this set of questions back and forth to make sure that you have what they think the scope of the problem is correctly in your mind. Then you move into the interviewing phase. This is asking a series of questions if necessary, and you don't want to be asking yes or no questions. This is an interview. This is why it's the reference interview, is you're talking one-on-one and getting them to expressively describe what the problem they're trying to solve is. And based on that, you may discover that they have the wrong problem in mind. They may have too narrow of a scope in mind, and you can help them realize what the actual problem that needs to be solved is, working together with this interview process. Then there's the searching process. The reference interviewer will work with the patron, especially at the collegiate level. They do not just hand you the book. They do not just do the work for you. It's very much about teaching the person how to fish so that they can be the fisherman, so that they don't have to come back to you again and again and ask these questions. It could be working through the problem with them on the computer. It could be showing them how to look it up, showing them Google dorks. A lot of people don't know a lot of the powerful options available in Google, so they can't drill down to accurate solutions more accurately. So working together, the librarian finds the solution to the question, the solution to the problem, hands it off after making sure that the patron thinks that it's the correct one that they're looking for. And then there's follow-up. This could be if they don't seem that they're sure about what's going on. You might drop them an IM later that day. You might send them an email. Hey, did that work for you? Do you have any further questions? There's one of the concepts with approachability and availability is also that you need to make sure that you're not wasting all your time on the same problem frequently. So a form of availability and approachability is having frequently asked questions. Have a good knowledge base. Make sure that your facts, your wiki, they're up to date, they're accurate, and so that if someone comes to you with simple questions that have been answered repeatedly already, you can steer them to the correct answer relatively quickly. So follow-up includes going through those materials and making sure that things are up to date. You also might look at it and say, that took me longer to answer the question than it should have, and this is within my area of responsibility, so maybe I should go and do a little bit of additional research on the subject myself. Make sure that you have the follow-up capability to be able to better answer those questions in the future. If you want to contact me, I'm very welcome to feedback on this. This is the first time I've given the talk, so I'm not sure how well it would go over, but I hope that I provided some interesting trivia at the very least. I can assure you that cargo cults have been featured in at least one edition of Trivial Pursuit, so this might be the thing that helps you finish your pie in a game, and it also pops up in bar trivia from time to time. I will be speaking at InfoCon up in Raleigh next week, and if you happen to be going to the Sands Pen Test Hack Fest, I'll also be talking about Purple Team exercises there, and that's mid-November. Are there any questions, comments? So the question is on my comment on automation and saying that the over-reliance of automation is a problem, but asking, shouldn't the tools be better? And absolutely. We spend a lot of money on very expensive tools that give us very bad results. I've used a security testing product for applications that will generate literally, I saw one report it generated that was 56,000 pages for a single application of garbage, and it's just noise. I would very much like the tools to be getting better. And in some cases, like for example, Burp Suite gives fairly usable descriptions of what problems are, but I see it as still a problem of training that we take people right out of college and say, you're an application security tester now, here's Burp Suite, go. And we don't take the time to make sure that they adequately understand what the tools are saying, even if the tools give relatively good information. But yes, better information coming out of the tools. And some, especially the tools such as Splunk, they're combining disparate data sources, can give you some really weird pieces of information. It'll weave together different alerts in ways that mix different terms for the same thing together. And that's a job for the people running the hunt team type tools within the company to go through and make sure that we are providing that more accurate information. So it's on us as the leader, as the highly technical leaders running the tools as well when we can customize them. Specific to security? So the question is, in my opinion, what is the biggest cargo cult problem today, both in security and in general? I see it most in operations, where, and again, I'm very sympathetic to these people. I don't want to come across as just saying they're idiots, they don't know what to do. They've not been told what to do, they've not been explained what to do. But they know that if we do the magical dance, if we press the right buttons, if we click the right alerts, or dismiss the right alerts in many cases, the beeping goes away, no more problem. It's taking the easy way out and not wanting to take the time, and in some cases not being given the time to deeply understand what causes issues and how to fix it. Within security, I see it very often in the highly automated tools that do vulnerability assessment. You put the agent on this system, you run it, it comes back and says you have 10,000 high critical vulnerabilities on the small system of servers. And we create policies and procedures that say we must have no high and critical vulnerabilities. And in many cases, these don't actually have impact. A common one is PHP has a lot of vulnerabilities, but a lot of them are very esoteric functions that aren't actually commonly used in PHP development. So the report will accurately say you're running PHP version 5.2.8, which has critical vulnerabilities, remote code execution, light everything on fire. And we've created these policies and procedures. It's magical doctrine that says if you get rid of all these vulnerabilities, you'll be secure, which isn't true. Per the talk yesterday, most of the vulnerabilities come in through things like phishing anyway. But we spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, forcing people to do upgrades of things that aren't actually important, and not spending that time making sure that they understand things, making sure that things that actually do matter get done. But we go through the magical incantation of getting rid of those red bars that pop up in the dashboard that goes to management. So the long rambling answer would be that we have created these magical policies that we have to follow that esoterically say that we will be secure. The recent Equifax breach has caused a lot of consternation within my personal industry, and we've done a lot of work around struts in cases where it may not actually affect our systems, but we had to do it because of due diligence. But we did the due diligence, but then in some cases we might have gone past it because of the magical dance that we need to do because federal regulators say that we have to, regardless of the efficacy. Anyone else? Thanks for your attention. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here and hope that you have a good rest of the day.